Shalom, welcome back to the sequential Midrash Agadah series, where we are walking through the Midrash Rabbah verse by verse, chapter by chapter, exactly as the ancient sages laid it out. Today we arrive at chapter 7 of Bereshis Rabbah, and this is a rich chapter. It covers the 5th and 6th days of creation, starting with the verse from Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, where God says, "Let the waters swarm with a swarming of living creatures, and let fowl fly about over the earth across the expanse of the heavens." Now, this single chapter takes us on quite a journey. We are going to explore God's unmatched creative power, particularly His ability to shape life within the waters. We are going to look at a fascinating series of halakhic rulings gone wrong, involving a rabbi named Yaakov of Kefar Nevorai, who keeps getting corrected by Rabbi Chagai. We will talk about the creation of the great sea giants, the behemoth and the leviathan, and why they have no mates. We will encounter a mysterious creature with 365 different colors, and we will end with one of the most profound teachings in all of Bereshis Rabbah about the creation of the demons, whose souls were made but whose bodies were never completed, because the Sabbath arrived. And from that, the sages draw a stunning lesson about the sanctity of Shabbat. So let's begin. The Midrash opens chapter 7 by citing a verse from Psalms, chapter 86, verse 8, which says, "There is none like you among the powers, O Lord, and there is nothing like your works." And then the Midrash makes a beautiful observation. It says, according to the way of the world, a person who is flesh and blood can only shape a form on dry land. They need to see the material they are working with. They need solid ground beneath them. But the Holy One, blessed is He, shapes a form even in the water. That is the meaning of our verse. God said, "Let the waters swarm with a swarming of living creatures." God commanded life to take shape within the depths of the sea itself. Think about what that means. No human craftsman could ever reach into the ocean and sculpt a living creature from within the water. But God does exactly that. The Midrash is telling us that creation was not limited by the same physical constraints that limit us. When it comes to God, even the formless depths of the sea become a workshop for life. Now, the Midrash shifts into something unexpected. It tells us about a man named Yaakov from the village of Kefar Nevorai, who lived in the city of Tyre. Yaakov issued a halakhic ruling, a legal ruling, that fish require ritual slaughter in order to be fit for consumption. In other words, he said you need to slaughter fish the same way you slaughter cattle or poultry. When Rabbi Chagai heard about this ruling, he sent Yaakov a sharp message. Come receive lashes. That is how seriously the sages took erroneous ruling. If you are going to issue rulings in Torah law, you had better get them right. But Yaakov did not back down immediately. He objected and said, does a person who states words of Torah receive lashes? He was essentially saying, I was just teaching Torah. Why would you punish me for that? Rabbi Chagai replied, first, bend over to be flogged, and then I will explain it to you. And after Yaakov submitted, Rabbi Chagai explained the error. He pointed out that regarding fish, the Torah does not use the word slaughtered. It uses the word gathered. The verse in Numbers chapter 11, verse 22 says, can sheep and cattle be slaughtered for them? Or if all the fish of the sea will be gathered for them, would it suffice for them? You see, sheep and cattle require slaughter. Fish require only gathering. That is a fundamental distinction in Torah law. Now, Yaakov, to his credit, accepted the correction gracefully. He said to Rabbi Chagai, go on with your beating and compile your discourse, for it is good to learn from. That's a remarkable response. He embraced the rebuke because he recognized it as an opportunity to learn. But the Midrash is not done with Yaakov yet. It tells us about another erroneous ruling he made. Yaakov ruled that it is permissible to circumcise the son of a non-Jewish woman born from a Jewish father on the Sabbath. Now, circumcision on the Sabbath is only permitted for a Jewish child whose 8th day falls on the Sabbath. And the key question here is, what determines if a child is Jewish? This leads to an important discussion about lineage. The Midrash brings the verse from Numbers chapter 1, verse 18, which says, they established their genealogy according to their families, according to their father's household. The phrase, according to their father's household, tells us that in Torah law, the paternal family is called family. The maternal family is not called family in the same legal sense. However, and this is the critical point, whether a child is Jewish follows the mother, not the father. So a child born from a non-Jewish mother, even if the father is Jewish, is not considered Jewish, and therefore circumcision on the Sabbath would not apply. Once again, Rabbi Chagai corrected Yaakov. And once again, Yaakov ultimately accepted the correction. The Midrash now returns to our verse and focuses on the second half, the part that says, and let fowl fly about over the earth, across the expanse of the heavens. The Midrash makes another beautiful observation about the uniqueness of God's works. It says, according to the way of the world, a king of flesh and blood builds a palace, and he settles dwellers in the upper stories and the lower stories. But is it possible for him to also settle dwellers that are suspended in mid-air? Certainly not. But the Holy One, blessed is he, settles dwellers that are suspended in mid-air, as it is written in our verse, and let fowl fly about over the earth across the expanse of the heavens. This is a poetic way of saying that birds, creatures that live suspended between heaven and earth, are proof of God's creative genius. No human architect can build a dwelling in mid-air, but God created an entire kingdom of creatures that live and thrive in that space. The Midrash also briefly notes that the word wing in the verse and all winged fowl is understood as a reference to the peacock. The peacock, with its extraordinary plumage, is singled out because the verse makes a special mention of winged creatures, and the peacock's wings are of singular beauty. Now we arrive at verse 21, which says, "And God created the great sea giants." The Hebrew word here is taninim, and the Midrash expounds on this word in a fascinating way. Rabbi Pinhas said in the name of Rabbi Aha, the word taninim is written in the Torah without a second yud, so that it can be read in the singular. And this singular reading is an allusion to the behemoth and the Leviathan, which have no mates. Now, this requires some explanation. The Leviathan is a monstrous creature of the sea, and the behemoth is a gigantic land animal, described in great detail in the book of Job, chapters 40 and 41. According to the Midrash, God originally created the Leviathan as male and female, but God perceived that if these creatures were to mate and bear offspring, they would destroy the entire world. So God killed the female Leviathan, preserving it for the righteous in the future, in the world to come. And God did similarly with the behemoth. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish adds another layer. He says the behemoth does technically have a mate, but it has no desire for procreation. As it is stated in Job chapter 40, verse 17, the sinews of his testicles are entangled, because the behemoth has no reproductive drive. The sinews remain constricted. The Midrash then mentions a unique creature called the Zavua. Rabbi Huna said in the name of Rabbi Mesana, the Zavua is formed from a white seminal drop, and yet it has 365 different colors, corresponding to the days of the solar year. This is a creature that embodies the full spectrum of the year's cycle in its very appearance. The Midrash now takes us into a detailed halakhic discussion about the prohibition of kilayim, which refers to the mixing or crossbreeding of different species. This is a Torah prohibition found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19. Rabbi Yirmiyah the Kohen asked Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, "What is the law regarding one who mates two kinds of sea creatures?" Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish replied that it is forbidden. He pointed to the phrase in our verse, "after their kinds," and said that since this expression is written regarding sea creatures as well, the prohibition of kilayim applies even in the ocean. But Rabbi Yirmiyah the Kohen objected. He said the expression "after their kinds" is not stated with specific reference to fish. He was arguing that the kilayim prohibition might not extend to fish specifically. The Midrash tells us that with this argument, Rabbi Yirmiyah the Kohen spread his net over Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. In other words, he won the debate on that particular point. However, the Midrash also records the view of Rabbi Yonah, who found another way to apply the kilayim prohibition to fish. He said the expression "after their kinds" can be applied to the prohibition of leading two species together. And how does one lead two fish together? One brings two fish, one white and one of a different species, ties them together with a reed and pulls them through the water. That act would constitute a violation of kilayim. Now we arrive at one of the most profound sections of this entire chapter. The Midrash turns to Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, which says, "God said, 'Let the earth bring forth living creatures, each according to its kind, animal and creeping thing, and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind.'" The Midrash notices something remarkable. In God's utterance, 4 entities are mentioned: living creatures, animal, creeping thing, and beasts of the earth. But when the Torah describes the actual creation in the next verse, only 3 are mentioned. Living creatures is omitted. Why? Rabbi Elazar gives a stunning answer. He says the expression "living creatures" in God's utterance is a reference to the spirit of Adam, the first man. The soul of Adam was created first among all living creatures. But his body was not created until later, as described in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. So Adam's spirit is listed in the command, but his physical creation is omitted from the execution because it had not yet taken place. The Midrash also asks why the verse says, "God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind," with beasts of the earth mentioned first, when in the previous verse it was mentioned last. Rabbi Hosea the Great answers that This is a reference to the serpent, the primeval serpent, who was more clever than all other beasts of the field, merits special mention because of his importance. And then the Midrash arrives at what I consider the climax of this chapter. It asks, why does the previous verse mention 4 items, but the actual creation enumerates only 3? Rabbi gives the answer. He says the expression souls of living beings in the previous verse is a reference to the demons, the Shedim, the demons whose souls the Holy One, blessed is He, created. And here is the key teaching. When God was engaged in the creation of the demons, He had already created their souls. But before He could create their bodies, the sanctity of the Sabbath came upon the world, and consequently, He did not create their bodies. The demons remain as souls without physical form, because the Sabbath arrived, and all creative work had to cease. Now, from this, the Midrash draws an extraordinary lesson in proper conduct. It says, the Torah thus intended to teach you a lesson in proper conduct from God's own behavior. If a person has in his hand a precious item or a valuable stone, and he is in the midst of working on it on the eve of the Shabbath, right before sunset, we say to him, throw it away from yourself. Stop what you are doing, because God Himself, who spoke and the world came into existence, who had already created the demons' souls, and who was prepared to create their bodies, chose not to complete that work because the Sabbath had arrived. All the more so, then, should you cease all work when the Sabbath arrives. If God stopped in the middle of creation itself for the sake of Sabbath, how much more so should we be willing to put down whatever we are holding, no matter how precious, when that sacred time begins. And that, friends, is chapter 7 of Bereshit Rabbah. We started with God's unmatched power to shape life in the waters. We walked through the humbling correction of a rabbi who issued faulty rulings and the grace with which he accepted rebuke. We marveled at the behemoth and the leviathan, creatures so powerful that God Himself had to limit their reproduction. And we ended with the demons, those incomplete beings who stand as eternal testimony to the sanctity of the Sabbath. The message that rings through this entire chapter is one of divine sovereignty. God creates life where no human can, in the sea, in the air, even in the realm of the unseen. And when the Sabbath arrives, even God's own creative power diverges to that holiness. If that is not a lesson worth carrying with you into your week, I don't know what is. Thank you very much for watching. If this series is helping you go deeper into the Midrash, please like the videos, subscribe so you never miss an episode. I will see you in the next video. Shalom.